Senator Kaine.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses. This is very hard because diplomacy with an adversary, with an enemy, is hard. Diplomacy with a friend can be hard. But diplomacy with an enemy, President Truman, when he proposed to spend billions of dollars to rebuild the economy of Germany after they had done 2 wars against the U.S. in 25 years, that was hard. And there were objections and there were no votes. President Kennedy, nuclear test ban treaty with the Soviet Union, during the Bay of Pigs they were negotiating, that was hard. It was controversial and there were no votes. Diplomacy with an adversary is hard. Diplomacy with an adversary is often necessary. This is a deal that, in my review, produces a dramatically better position for about 15 years than the status quo before negotiations started. When you started the negotiations, right before Iran had a program that was 19,000 centrifuges and growing, you've knocked it back to 6,000. 12,000 kilograms of enriched uranium, enough for multiple weapons, you've knocked it back to 300. An enrichment level 20% and climbing, you've knocked it back to 3.67%. A heavy water plutonium facility at Iraq, they're dismantling it. They were on a path where they had a huge program and it was growing. For 15 years, this deal with the inspections mechanisms, et cetera, produces a dramatically better status quo for the United States, for regional allies, for the world. My questions are about after year 15. Secretary Moniz, various provisions start to come off, certain elements of the program, certain inspections beginning in year 8, 10, year 15, the 300-kilogram cap comes off. When you get to year 25, here's how I read this deal. The deal basically is Iran commits in the first paragraph of the agreement, under no circumstances will Iran ever seek to develop, purchase, or acquire nuclear weapons. They've agreed to all the NPT obligations going forward, and they've agreed that any nuclear program will be completely civil in nature. They make that commitment. What we have to determine if they would cheat would be the intelligence that we have, the knowledge we've gained through 25 years of enhanced inspections, and the ongoing inspections under the NPT, especially the additional protocol. Is that level of knowledge sufficient at year 25 and thereafter to detect if Iran tries to violate this deal and acquire nuclear weapons?
Well, I think it certainly puts us in a far stronger position than we would be otherwise, and I think the risks on their part would be enormous to try to break their commitments. And I think you've put your finger on a very important thing, which I think our intelligence community would support. We should not forget the tremendous knowledge of the program, what they're doing, where they're doing it, over 25 years. We will have a lot of indicators to really amplify our national means.
That's a good segue to the question I want to ask Secretary Kerry, which is about alternatives. You talked with Senator Murphy about them. I think there were those who objected to the negotiations starting in November of 2013. They were against that diplomatic beginning. If we could go back to that status quo, it seems to me that the status quo then was we had sanctions, they were punishing Iran, hurting their economy, but they were racing ahead on their nuclear program. We were hurting their economy, but the nuclear program, 19,000 centrifuges and climbing, 12,000 kilograms and climbing, enrichment percentage climbing, Iraq heavy water moving ahead. If we just had lived with that status quo, it seems to me one of two things was going to happen. Either they were going to eventually capitulate because of the sanctions, or they were going to get a nuclear weapon. There were two odds. I don't know, and I'm not going to ask you to assign odds to those two things, but there was a significant risk. The program, had you not started diplomacy, they were going to get a nuclear weapon, and you have forestalled that. So that was one alternative. We do nothing, but that status quo was a dangerous one, where their program was rocketing ahead. Let me mention another alternative, because it's been mentioned by members of this body. After the framework was announced on April 2, a member of this body who has been a loud and influential voice in this issue said bombing Iran to end their program would only take a few days. Mr. Secretary, you've been at war. Do you find that to be a realistic statement?
Well, I find it to be a factual statement in the sense that it would only take a few days, but I don't find it to be a realistic statement in terms of a policy. because the implications of that, if you're not at the end of your rope, in other words, if it's not last resort, would be extraordinarily complicated for the United States.
If we were to do that, that's an alternative. If we were to do that right now, would we have international support for that?
Not on your life. No way. In the middle of this
And would we have an international legal basis for doing it? We were in Israel in January. A number of us met with Israeli intelligence officials who said they have concluded that Iran is trying to get to a threshold, but that Iran has not yet made a decision to pursue and acquire nuclear weapons. If we were to initiate a war against Iran when they had not yet made that decision, would there be an international basis for a war?
No. And furthermore, we'd be proceeding without any of our allies, which is not a small consequence.
Let me flip it around on you, because I want to talk about credible military threat. If this deal is done, and if Iran confirms to the entire global community in the UN, Iran reaffirms that under no circumstances will Iran ever seek, develop, or acquire any nuclear weapons. They pledged that to the world. We're all in agreement. And then they break toward a nuclear weapon. Would we be more likely to have the support of international partners if we want to take military action to stop them from doing what they pledged not to do?
Absolutely.
Would we have a greater legal basis to justify taking military action to stop them from doing what they have pledged not to do?
Yes.
And would we have, because of an inspections regime plus existing intelligence, a lot more knowledge about how to target military action, increasing the credibility of our military threat?
Yes.
I don't have any other questions, Mr. Chair.